Real. I love the support that the Utah Valley University gives to the Constitution, that they've created a center for the study of constitutions and the specific emphasis on the American Constitution. It is an incredible document that has done wonderful things and held us to account for the bad things that we've done. I'm going to talk about federalism. Specifically, I want to talk about America's dynamic federal system. Now, in 1988, a historian, Wilfred McClay, wrote an article on American federalism, and he concluded that a lot of people think that American federalism is dead, right? The way the Constitution set it up was how we practiced it for the first 50, 60, maybe 100 years, but we've moved so far away from that that we can't go back. And so in a way, the Constitution is dead. McClay's arguing against that. He's saying it's actually a very dynamic, adaptable, flexible system. And if we understand that, then we'll be able to adapt it, adopt it to our day and age. And it's this thesis I want to pick up on in two ways. The first one, was that really what the Founding Fathers thought of the federal system that they created? Did they really think that it was adaptable and flexible? So to get into that, let me first of all give a brief description of what federalism is. It's a political organization, a way of organizing a political society. It has two constitutionally established governments, and by constitutionally, it's preserving the integrity of each one. So one doesn't dominate and control the others. There's a certain element of independence for each of those different orders of government. So there's an autonomy from each one, and each is accountable to their respective electorates. So the state governments are responsible to their citizens. The national government is responsible to the people as a whole. Now, the purpose of federalism is to both protect the integrity of the individual members and also to provide for the common good. If you think about a state, a small state is really nice because it gets to deal with a group of people who have similar ideas. The people are closer to their government. The government gets to respond to those sorts of things. But the problem with a small state is it can't defend itself very well against a large state with a large army and a large treasury. So small states have oftentimes found it beneficial to join together with other states in an alliance, in a pact, a treaty, or a more formal form, which would be called a covenant. And federalism actually comes from covenant. The term feudus in Latin means covenant. And actually, our first indication of a covenant society goes back to ancient Israel. And that's where the tribes of ancient Israel joined together in a way that preserved the integrity of each individual tribe while also uniting them in a common group to support the common good and the interest of the nation. That idea was rediscovered in the 16th century by a group of Reformed Protestants, and they began to form political and religious organizations. The political organizations they called covenant societies. The religious ones they called covenant societies. The political ones they called federal societies. Now, every major group that came to America and every major religion that settled in America came from that Reformed Protestant tradition up to the Constitution. In fact, the Mayflower Compact, you know, those guys who sailed on the Mayflower, before they got off the boat, they signed what they called a covenant that was essentially uniting them together in a common endeavor, but protecting the individual, the liberty of each one. Americans experimented with that idea for the next 170 years. The Constitution is a culmination of that covenant way of thinking of forming a political society. So America had 170 years of experimenting with this idea before they established it as the Constitution. Right? That's 100 years before John Locke developed the idea. Now, and even the Massachusetts Constitution, which was written by John Adams, describes that Constitution as a covenant between each individual citizen and the citizens collectively. So it's an interesting and a powerful idea. It's also very dynamic and adaptable. All right, and it's so adaptable that this is a true statement. Every generation of Americans has redefined their system of federalism. The borders, the boundaries, how they think about that, right? You can think about federalism as separating the national and the state governments totally, completely separate, so one does one thing and the other does another thing. That's kind of how the second generation of Americans thought of it. And then those two begin to overlap, right? In that picture, I have them overlapping. My laser pointer doesn't work. It has them overlapping, and that's how the system has become. So every generation is able to adapt this. So I want to go to the question, before that, federalism today. Federalism today rests on three pillars. We can characterize it by three things. The first is a system of intergovernmental grants. And these are grants that the federal government gives to state and local governments. It happened after the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913, which allowed the federal government to do an income tax. And so it's collected more money than the states, and it uses that money, it sends some of that money to the states to help them out. The last figures that we have on this, there's 1,683, if I remember my figures correctly. And that's over 400, let me get my glasses to make sure I get the numbers right. That's $697 billion in 2018. So that's a pretty big system that has an enormous influence in shaping our federal system. There's the figures for how it is. The second pillar is a broad bipartisan support for a strong national government. Now, you may think, there's a division between Democrats and Republicans about how these powers should be divided, what the state should do and what the federal government should do. But there's still a broad general agreement, and there has been for most of the 20th century, that we want the federal government to be fairly strong. To give you an example of this, in 1955, Republican President Eisenhower set up a commission to study all of the things that the federal government had started to do, and to look and see if there were any things that could be returned to the states. That commission did this major study, and they came back with 3 things that they thought could be returned to the states. That's it. Of all the stuff that the federal government had taken on with the New Deal and everything else, there were only 3 things that could be returned to the states. And did they do it? Not a single one went back to the states. Right? And you can look, even though different people have talked about federalism and giving power to the states, it really hasn't happened that much. There's been this broad bipartisan consensus for a strong national government. That's being challenged. The Tea Party challenged it. Different elements of the Republican Party today are challenging that. And groups of progressive Democrats are beginning to see that there are problems with the federal government having too much power and authority. In fact, the dean of Yale Law School, Heather Gerken, is one of the leading progressive Democrats championing the idea of federalism in our day. And the third is the Supreme Court's deference to the executive, specifically to federal agencies. The Supreme Court has basically said, if Congress delegates power to an agency and the agency makes a rule, we'll go along with it. Now, the Supreme Court has started to challenge that. And with conservatives getting more members on the Supreme Court, we're starting to see a pushback against that idea. In fact, all 3 of these things are being pushed back in our day and age. Republican governors in a number of states for the first time have rejected millions of dollars of federal grants. And as I said, the Tea Party and other groups have begun to challenge the idea of that bipartisan consensus. And the Supreme Court is questioning whether they should continue to defer to executive agencies. So we're seeing a pushback, and we're seeing the system adapting and adjusting. It'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. So let me go to the big question that I kind of want to ask. Is this flexibility in the federal system part of the founders' original intent? Did they see it this way? Or is this just something that we've adapted and developed as a result of contingencies that we've experienced, depression and war and things like that? I'm going to rephrase the question. I'm going to put it in the terms that Publius did, the author of the Federalist Papers, right, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. I'm going to look specifically at what Hamilton and Madison said in the Federalist Papers. And the question, the way they asked it was, how should the line between the federal and state governments be drawn? And how should an intergovernmental conflict or dispute be resolved? Now, they had three answers to these questions. The first one is that the Constitution would be used to define that line between the national government and the state governments. And the way they understood that, what they were trying to accomplish was to give the federal government general issues that concerned everybody, war and defense, interstate commerce, and left the practical issues up to the states. But there's a problem with the Constitution. Actually, three problems. What is the Constitution? Oh, that's easy, right? It's just the text, right? It's that thing that they signed and the states ratified. But is it really just the text of the Constitution? Abraham Lincoln didn't think so. He said the Constitution of the United States includes the Declaration of Independence. See, up until Lincoln, we'd pretty much forgotten the Declaration of Independence. That was our notice to Great Britain. We're out of here, right? We're gone. You guys have done things that we don't agree with, so we're leaving. And so once they left and they created a government, most Americans were like, we don't need that document anymore. But Lincoln came back and said, that's a founding element that we need to understand the Constitution with. Those natural rights that the Declaration talks about, you have to have that in order to understand the Constitution. Well, if the Constitution is the Declaration of Independence, might it be something else as well? Blackstone's commentaries on the law, which the Founding Fathers knew and referenced when they were talking about law and developing the law and the systems of government. Would Locke be part of that? And other philosophers who shaped their ideas and understandings of what went on? So, and then there's who? Who gets to interpret the Constitution? In our day and age, how many of you say that the Supreme Court is the one that interprets the Constitution? How many of you say it's not the Supreme Court? How many of you say, I don't know, I don't want to risk an opinion? Right, okay. Well, you probably picked up on my way of asking questions. They're trick questions. The Supreme Court declares we're the ones who get to make the final word on what the Constitution means. Does it say that in the Constitution? No. No. The actual understanding is that the Supreme Court would get to have a say in interpreting the Constitution, but how about the president? Every strong president in the history of the United States, from Washington to Jefferson to Lincoln, all the way up through Wilson and Reagan, Eisenhower, Nixon, they've all said, I as president get to interpret the Constitution. And members of Congress have said, we get to interpret the Constitution. And states have said, we get to interpret the Constitution. There's actually a competition that's built into the system that they get to compete with each other for what the Constitution means. And that's going to be important in a minute. So it's not just the Supreme Court. That's what the Supreme Court has declared for themselves, but there's no real justification for that. And how should the Constitution be interpreted? That's a little bit more difficult, right? There's the living Constitution. The Constitution is alive. It's a document that we breathe our own understanding and ideas and values into. We don't need to be restricted to the horse and buggy era. We can give a modern interpretation to it. There are others who say we need to go back to the Founding Fathers and understand their intent and how they understood it. There's some who say, let's just look at the text. There's some who say, look at the Founding Fathers' general ideas. So there are multiple ways of interpreting the Constitution. On top of that, the Constitution has a number of ambiguous phrases. Interstate commerce, which we'll talk about in a little bit. What does that mean? What does that restricted to? Is that just commerce that crosses state borders? Or is that stuff that actually happens inside of a state? Necessary and proper. What's the necessary and proper clause? What does that require? What does that prohibit? A Republican form, the states are guaranteed a Republican form of government. What's a Republican form of government? So there's a number of questions and challenges with just saying the text of the Constitution tells us what federalism should be and what the responsibilities of the national government is and what the responsibility of the state governments is. That's it. We can't rely just on the Constitution, and the founders themselves didn't. The second thing that they used were institutions. They created institutions, the executive, the legislature, the Supreme Court, and the states. And they set up a process for how they would interact with each other. So that's an intention. Let the system process. Let it work its way out. There's competition. There are checks and balances intentionally set up in that system. So let's have the competition. Let's work it out. Now, the Supreme Court is one of those, and the Supreme Court gets to declare laws unconstitutional. If you go to law school, one of the first things they'll tell you when you learn about judicial review is that the Supreme Court created this power itself. John Marshall did it in a Supreme Court case. It's not true. If you look in the Federalist Papers, it's mentioned 4 times. It's not real clear and evident. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look closely, it's there. They intended that to happen. Congress also gets to have a role in this, and you get intergovernmental negotiations, right, between states. The states can support and they can stymie the federal government and the things it does. And the last thing that Publius talks about, both Hamilton and Jefferson, is the people get to decide in elections, right? Who do you vote for? Do you vote for the person who says we need a stronger national government? Or do you vote for the people who say we need stronger state governments? In that way, the people get to participate. It is, after all, a popular government. It is popular sovereignty where the sovereignty rests with the people. And so we get to have a say in shaping that. Now, where Hamilton and Madison both agreed that these elements would all be in play in shaping the federal system, where they disagreed is the emphasis that they placed on that. Hamilton wanted the people to have a big say. I think he thought he would have more success with the people than he would with the elites of his day. And so he said it should be the people. Madison said the people are the last resort. So let me work through this. It's in 17 where Hamilton develops this idea. And in 17 he says, the people's choice, who they choose, will they choose the national government, the federal government, or will they choose the states, is based on 3 variables. The first variable is proximity, right? People are going to vote for the government that's closest to them because that's just a natural thing that humans do, right? Me and my brother, we fight. But if the neighbor gets involved, it's me and my brother against the neighbor, right? And if it's my high school, it's me, my brother, my neighbor against the high school on the other side of town. And if it's, if it's states, well, anybody here from Idaho? We're against Utah, right? It's kind of state against state. But that's proximity. We have a natural loyalty to the thing that's closest to us. So Hamilton said the states will benefit from that. When it comes to a competition, the states are going to have the upper hand on that one. The second thing he said is the government that provides for the safety and security of the people. In Hamilton's age, who was that? It was the local government, the state governments. They provided the police, they provided the safety and security. Thus it came to a war, then it would be the national government. And the last thing he said is the best administered government. Now, who do you think Hamilton thought would be the best administered government? The states or the national government? He didn't say in 17, because he wants you to think in 17 that the states are going to win this battle. But in 28, he says the federal government will be the best administered government. And he says that will be the most powerful element that affects what the people choose. Right? So he says the best administered will outweigh the other 2 elements. Now, Madison, in number 50, said we need to use the people as a last resort. Because he said relying on the people to make these decisions does 3 things. First of all, it destroys veneration for the Constitution. I love that word, veneration. You can just roll it around in your mouth. Veneration, veneration. Venerate, right? What does venerate mean? To love, to support, to embrace. And what leads people to love, support, and embrace something like a piece of paper that the Constitution is that's called the Constitution? Time. Over time, we come to appreciate it. And he says if we're constantly changing and adapting it, we're not going to venerate it. The second thing he says is if we rely on the public, it's going to disturb public tranquility. How many of you like election season? Right. It's every 2 years, thank goodness. But can you imagine if we could appeal to the public whenever there's a dispute or a problem going on? That would be a real issue. That would be a real problem. It would disrupt us, right? And so he says that would disturb public tranquility. And the third one is it would disrupt checks and balances. The system created by the Founding Fathers is carefully calibrated to check and balance each system of government. And if you rely on the people, they don't understand it that well, they're going to disrupt the system. So Madison doesn't want to rely on the people too much. He says as a last result we can do it, but we shouldn't use that first. So they have agreements, they have disagreements. My point is this: the system is an incredibly flexible system that they created, right? With 3 different elements, and the people get to have a role in that. I would argue that the people have the predominant role. If I look back in history, I would say where public opinion lies, where they think the best administered government is, that's the one they're most likely to support. Now, so I have 2 questions to conclude with. The first one, has this system worked out? Or has one government eclipsed the other, taken too much power, and therefore controls the other governments? The second one, every generation of Americans rewrites the federalism system. How are you going to rewrite that system? You get a say in it, and it's something to think about. Thank you.